Have you ever heard of a war where the enemy was a bunch of flightless birds? No, it's not a joke. Welcome to the Great Emu War of 1932. Now picture this, the year is 1932, and in the vast expanse of the Australian outback, a peculiar war cry echoes, not that of a fierce warrior, but of an emu. Yes, you heard it right, an emu. These large, flightless birds native to Australia were about to become the center of a military operation. An unusual challenge was on the horizon for the Australian military, as they found themselves pitted against these feathered foes. With their large size, rapid speed, and a surprising knack for survival, these emus were not to be underestimated. This wasn't your typical battlefield showdown, folks, so buckle up, folks. It's time to dive beak first into this feathery fiasco. Imagine being a soldier, your enemy, a horde of big-eyed, long-legged birds. Sounds like a bad dream, doesn't it? Well, in the summer of 1932, this was the reality for a group of Australian soldiers. Their adversaries weren't spies or revolutionaries, but rather, a swarm of emus. Yes, you heard that right. Emus. Those awkward, flightless birds that seem more suited for a children's cartoon than a battlefield. Now you might be wondering, why on earth would the military get involved with these feathered creatures? It turns out these seemingly innocent birds were wreaking havoc on the wheat crops of Western Australia. Picture this. Thousands of emus in a feeding frenzy, chomping their way through field after field of wheat. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet, and these birds were not holding back. These emus, with their big eyes and long legs, might not look threatening at first glance. But don't let their goofy exterior fool you, they're surprisingly tough and resilient. And when you have thousands of them descending on your crops, well, it's a bit like being invaded by an army of feathery locusts. And it's not just about the crops. These birds were also causing significant damage to fences, allowing rabbits to get in and cause even more destruction. It was a double whammy for the farmers. So, what do you do when you're faced with an emu problem of this magnitude? Well, you call in the military, of course. In a decision that might raise a few eyebrows today, the Australian government decided to wage war on the emus. Yes, a war, against birds. The soldiers, armed with machine guns, were sent into the fields to deal with the emu issue. They were probably expecting an easy victory. After all, how tough could a bunch of birds be? And so, the battle lines were drawn. Little did the soldiers know what they were up against. Now, you'd think this would be an easy win for the military, right? Well, think again. Picture this. A battalion of soldiers, machine guns at the ready, and a crowd of unsuspecting emus grazing in the Australian outback. It sounds like the beginning of a one-sided battle, doesn't it? But oh, how the tables turned. When the first shots rang out, the emus didn't stand around waiting to become feather dusters. No, these birds proved they were not your average poultry. They scattered and ran in all directions, their long, powerful legs carrying them at a speed that would make an Olympic sprinter jealous. The soldiers were left shooting at dust clouds and feathers, their bullets finding more earth than emu. As the emus scattered like feathers in a windstorm, the soldiers couldn't hide their surprise. Imagine the scene, hardened soldiers, trained to face the most dangerous of human foes, outsmarted by a flock of birds. And what about the machine guns? They were as useful as a chocolate teapot. The emus were too fast, too agile, and there were just too many of them. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net. The soldiers might as well have been shooting at shadows. Perhaps the most amusing part of this whole encounter was the soldiers' reaction. They were flabbergasted, their faces a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and dare I say, a touch of respect for these feathered foes. Who knew a bird-brained plan could be so effective? At the end of the day, the soldiers had to admit defeat. Their bullets had found little more than air and dirt, and the emus? Well, they were probably laughing it up in the outback, toasting to their victory with a round of eucalyptus leaves. Who would have thought? Emus, 1, Australian Army, 0. The unexpected battle was over, and the emus had emerged victorious. But this was just the beginning of the Great Emu War, a war that was anything but ordinary. As it turns out, emus are not just cute, they're cunning too. These feathered fugitives were not your average bird brains. In the heat of this unexpected war, they showcased an impressive display of strategic skills. Who would have thought that a bird, which could easily be mistaken for a fluffy cloud on stilts, would outsmart a trained military? The emus, probably after a roundtable conference or a quick birdie huddle, learned to scatter at the first sound of danger. They'd spread out in all directions, and then, as if someone yelled, "Serpentine!" they'd start running in zigzag patterns. It's like they'd been watching old war movies or playing too much Call of Duty. The soldiers, on the other hand, were left scratching their heads. They'd aim their guns and the birds would scatter. They'd chase one group and another would pop up behind them. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole, but with giant birds and in the vast Australian outback. And let's not forget about the emu's top speed. These birds are no slouches. They can reach speeds up to 31 miles per hour. That's faster than Usain Bolt. Imagine trying to hit a target that's not only zigzagging but also sprinting faster than the world's fastest man. The soldiers were probably thinking, this was not in the manual. We trained for human foes, not feathered ones. But the emus, they were having a field day. It's as if they were saying, you can take our wheat, but you'll never take our freedom. In this peculiar turn of events, the emus were proving to be quite the adversaries. They were a force, a feathered force to be reckoned with. The military, trained to handle all sorts of warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered by a bunch of birds. The Great Emu War was turning out to be less of a war, and more of a comedy of errors. But one thing was clear. The feathered foes were proving to be quite the adversaries. Desperate times call for desperate measures. The military needed a new game plan. So they decided to think outside the box, or in this case, outside the military vehicle. The soldiers, in their quest to outsmart the emus, came up with the novel idea of mounting their guns on trucks. Now this may sound like a stroke of genius, a way to level the playing field, right? Well, not quite. You see, the emus were not your average foes. These were not targets that just sat around waiting to be picked off. No, these were fast-running, agile birds with a knack for survival. They were the Usain Bolts of the bird kingdom, if you will. And as it turned out, putting guns on trucks was like bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. The trucks, unlike our feathered friends, were not built for speed or maneuverability, especially not on the rough Australian outback. They were heavy, lumbering vehicles, and they simply couldn't keep up with the nimble emus. It was almost comical, like watching a tortoise trying to chase a hare. So the military's grand plan of motorized warfare turned out to be a bust. The trucks couldn't get close enough for accurate shooting, and the emus seemed to take delight in outrunning their mechanical pursuers. The soldiers' shots went wide, their plans went awry, and their hopes of a quick victory went up in smoke. And so, the tactical turnaround that was supposed to tip the scales in favor of the Australian military only served to underscore their predicament. They had underestimated their opponents, overestimated their own capabilities, and had once again failed to achieve their objectives. And the score was emus, 2, Australian Army 0. Not quite the scoreboard the soldiers were hoping for. And so, the Great Emu War raged on, with the emus still running the show. Sometimes you have to admit when you're beat, even if your opponent is a bunch of birds. In this case, the birds were emus, and the opponent was the Australian military. Yes, you heard that right. The military against birds. After a few weeks of what can only be described as the most peculiar war in history, the military decided to withdraw. Now, you might be thinking, why? They have guns, vehicles, trained personnel. How could a bunch of birds cause them to retreat? Well, the answer is quite simple. The emus were too mighty, too numerous, and too bird-like. The military, despite their best efforts, had little success in reducing the emu population. They fired thousands of rounds, chased the emus across the vast Australian landscape, and yet, the emus prevailed. It was like trying to catch the wind with a net. The emus were everywhere, and nowhere, all at once. Not only was this endeavor proving to be an exercise in futility, but it was also quite costly. The ammunition, the manpower, the time, all of this was adding up. And for what? To wage a war against birds? It was becoming increasingly clear that this was not a battle that could be won with bullets. This war, if you can even call it that, was deemed too costly and ineffective. The military had to face the harsh reality. They were not going to win this one. The emus had outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and outlasted them. It was a humbling experience, to say the least. So, the military did what any sensible entity would do in the face of such an unusual and unbeatable foe. They surrendered. They took their guns, their vehicles, their bruised egos, and they retreated. The war was over. The emus had won. And so, the emus emerged victorious. Who would have thought? After all, they were just a bunch of birds. But as this peculiar event in history shows us, sometimes the most unlikely opponents can prove to be the most formidable. So what happens when you lose a war to a bunch of birds? You might be left with a lot of egg on your face, not to mention a few feathers. However, the aftermath of the Great Emu War of 1932 was more than just a punchline to a peculiar historic event. While it's easy to chuckle at the thought of the Australian military being outwitted by emus, the war highlighted some serious issues about land use and crop protection in Australia. As the dust settled and the laughter died down, the reality of the situation became clear. The emus were not the enemy. They were simply doing what came naturally to them, seeking food and water. The real issue was the struggle between man and nature, and how we use and protect our land. Farmers were facing the tough task of protecting their crops from the emus and other wildlife, while also trying to make a living from the land. It was a balancing act that was proving difficult to maintain. The government's solution to send in the military to cull the emu population was a short-term fix to a long-term problem. The Great Emu War was a wake-up call for Australia. It highlighted the need for sustainable farming practices and better land management. The emus, in their own unique way, had exposed the vulnerabilities of the farming sector and forced people to rethink their approach. In the years following the war, steps were taken to address these issues. New strategies and techniques were developed to protect crops and manage wildlife. The emus had not only won the war, but it also sparked a revolution in farming practices. So, while the Great Emu War of 1932 might be remembered as a humorous footnote in history, its impact was far-reaching. It was a stark reminder of the challenges of cohabiting with nature and the need for balance and sustainability in all our actions. The emus may have won the battle, but the war for sustainable farming practices was just beginning. You might be wondering, what happened to the emus? Well, let's just say they lived to peck another day. In the aftermath of the Great Emu War, the emus didn't just disappear into the sunset. No, these feathered survivors had a knack for sticking around, much to the chagrin of the local farmers. Their numbers had been reduced, but not nearly enough to solve the agricultural devastation they were causing. Ironically, it wasn't the military might of Australia that would eventually control the emu population. Instead, it was the introduction of a bounty system that proved to be the game-changer. A few years after the war, the Australian government decided to put a price on the emus' heads, or rather, their beaks. Farmers, hunters, and anyone with a knack for bird hunting turned their sights on the emus. This time it wasn't bullets flying around in a military campaign, but a more organized, economical approach to control the emu population. And guess what? It worked. The bounty system proved to be far more effective than a military operation. Over the next 6 months, nearly 40,000 emu bounties were claimed, significantly reducing the emu population and giving the farmers a much-needed respite. The emus, on the other hand, adapted to their new reality. They learned to keep a low profile, avoiding populated areas during the day and foraging for food at night. They became the elusive, nocturnal birds we know today. So, what's the moral of the story? Sometimes the most unconventional problems require the most unconventional solutions. And sometimes those solutions come from the most unexpected places. In this case, a military operation was outsmarted by a simple bounty system. And that, folks, is the tale of the Great Emu War, where birds ruled the battlefield. Remember, never underestimate your opponent, especially if they have feathers.